Okay, so now we go to the fifth chapter of the book, which is called Think Strategically and Act Decisively. So, the quote in context is from Kalam, where he says, "If you want to leave your footprints on the sands of time, do not drag your feet." It's a very profound quote, and this is from his book, The Wings of Fire, an amazing read where Kalam talks about the spiritual dimension of his scientific pursuit. And I start this chapter from the surgical strike that we experienced in 2016. So this was a great act of being strategic by our armed forces and at the same time acting with decisiveness. So one of the common mistakes that people do is to claim that, strategy is not for me. I'm just a, pawn. I'm a foot soldier and I'm not supposed to make strategy. And the question is not about making strategy for the organization or for your team or the client, etc. I think the ask is to think strategically about your life instead of thinking tactically. You really think strategically about it. And the first invocation is that of always think the big picture. Now, one of the propositions which I offer is that the evolution of your thinking is not a natural consequence of your career progression, which is to say that just because you graduated does not mean your thinking graduated. Okay, it doesn't mean your thinking also evolved. It may so happen that you might still be thinking very pedestally about the whole thing, and that is something that must be checked, and that's extremely critical that it is checked. Okay, so you have to think about the big picture at all times. And this big picture thinking is very, very critical, because if you don't think big picture, what happens to you is that you lose the overall sight. And there is a very beautiful saying which goes like, don't be busy reorganizing the chairs on the deck of Titanic. Because when you're busy reorganizing the chairs on the deck of Titanic, you are taking your eyes away from where the entire enterprise or the entire ship is heading. And what's the point of organizing the chairs when the whole ship ceases to exist after a point of time? So how do you think big picture? It starts with solving a problem, because I've always maintained that life is all about problem solving. Okay, whether you acknowledge it or you don't acknowledge it, whether you solve the problems consciously or you solve the problems unconsciously, life is all about solving problems, one problem after the next problem after the next problem. So whenever you encounter a problem, you have to ask yourself two questions. The first question is why to solve the problem, and the second question is how to solve the problem. Now answer this to me. What do you typically do? Do you really ask the question why to solve the problem, or do you assume that, yeah, if somebody higher up has given the problem to me, it ought to be solved? Well, not necessary. There is a very high possibility that the person who is throwing the problem at you may not have thought through the problem. And if you don't ask the question of why to solve the problem, you are gullible to be solving some very trivial problems. And the attitude towards problem solving can really determine whether you are thinking like a pharmacist or a doctor or a surgeon. Now, if I look at a pharmacist, how do most pharmacists behave? You go to a pharmacist, you show the prescription, the person looks at the convoluted handwriting and hands over the drugs to you. So you very easily switch from one pharmacist to another pharmacist who can give you a very good deal. You have no allegiance to the pharmacist, and neither the pharmacist has any skin in the game, because a pharmacist would never bother asking you again that how is your health. And at the first place, the pharmacist won't even bother what's the problem with you, right? So they would really be looking at the efficiency with which they can address the problem. So the people who behave like pharmacists at the workplace are those who don't want to get bothered about the big picture. They don't really get perturbed about why. They just want to get through the problem. So show me the problem and I'll give the solution to you. So those are the kind of people who are mostly like the pharmacist. The second are the doctors. Now, when you go to the doctor, you typically go with a symptom, and the doctor's skill is to distill the symptom down to the problem and to offer you solutions. So doctor has a slightly more skin in the game, because the doctor asks you how you are, and doctor also offers that if you don't feel well, you can see me after a week's time. So doctor is slightly perturbed about you, much more than a pharmacist is, and you find it difficult to trade doctor. You can very easily trade a pharmacist. Whoever gives you the best discount, you'll go with that pharmacist. But a doctor, you might be willing to pay premium to a doctor if the doctor sort of understands you better. So that's for the doctor. And there are employees who behave like a doctor, who really want to go to the depth of the problem and try to understand where it is coming from. And finally, you have a surgeon. Now you go to the surgeon as your last resort. You'd never go to the surgeon as somebody whom you are wanting to learn from immediately. You would have done your research, read about it, taken. And when you go to the surgeon doesn't give you much of a choice. A surgeon would never say that, all right, go and check on Google and tell me what do you feel about it. The surgeon will say, you have to go through this or otherwise it's a gone case. Okay. So surgeon has a very high skin in the game for you. Okay. Because surgeon is almost operating on you. And if you ask any surgeon, every surgeon would admit that, yeah, no two surgeries are same. Because there are 100 things that can go wrong in a surgery, and it's very difficult to sort of templatize a surgery. And these are the third category of employees who are not only understanding the problem, but they are redefining the problem in a way that it makes sense. So that is about having a big picture thinking. You have to think future back and outside in. For example, if I ask you that what do you want to become in the next 5 years, and you say that, hey, I want to become an entrepreneur, I want to start my own business, I want to be CEO of a company, I want to be an author, I want to be a doctoral student or a doctorate, better still. Now, there is one way of it is that you pray and you work in that direction and you hope that you reach there. And as somebody says, hope is not a good strategy. And the second is to really ask these three questions to you. The first is, what should I stop doing today? They'll take me closer to my target. What should I start doing today, and what should I sustain? Start, stop, sustain. The 3S model is a much more powerful way of understanding the same problem. So instead of looking at a present forward, which is I'm at present moment and I'll look into the future, instead of taking that approach, you take a future back approach. So you ascertain a target for yourself and then you work backwards from the target to sort of see if that particular thing really makes a huge difference for you, and more often than not, it does. So that is your future back thinking. At the same time, the outside in view. An outside in view means that instead of trying to change the world basis your temperament, and that's something that George Bernard Shaw does talk about, but you can't do that all the time. It might be useful to really have an outside in view, that what does the world need? Okay, and this is very important from an entrepreneur's perspective, because entrepreneurship happens when your unique competencies meets with a fertile market opportunity. Often you can create an opportunity also with your unique competence. That's also possible. But at any rate, it's very critical to have an understanding about what is happening around you. So an outside in view makes you much more clear about what kind of threats and opportunities exist, and as a result, you can make wise decisions. And here I talk about Dhoni, MS Dhoni, the former captain of Indian cricket team, as to how he was so street smart because he could read the weak signals that the opponents or the other team players could not. So that is where he didn't have any skill or a prodigious talent the way one would claim Sachin had, or maybe Kohli had, or somebody else. But I think the reason he dominated the game is because of his ability to think future back and to think outside in. Construct proprietary mental models. The mental models are like mental heuristics or hacks or the rules of thumb. And what they do is that they really reduce your years of experience and exposure onto some simple go, no go decisions, so that every time a problem comes across you, you don't go back to the first principles. Of course, once in a while, it is good to go back to first principles if the problem is really of a high gravitas, something that Elon Musk would strongly advocate, but not all the time. So these mental models or hacks, and I've shared a few in the book about my own self, they really help you distill the incoming information into a very simple decision-making matrix. Okay? Of course, you can revise these mental models, but you ought to have mental models. For example, one of the mental models that I have is that whenever a business opportunity comes my way, I always use this rubric for understanding going about it. The rubric comprises of three elements: knowledge, money, and brand. And what I've said is that if I give 2 out of 3, which between knowledge, money, and brand, I'll go with the opportunity. But if I don't get any, or even if I get one, I would typically not go, unless of course the one is knowledge. I'd always go with something that gives me very high knowledge. But if it just gives me a brand but no money and knowledge, I most likely would not go with it. If it only gives me money and no knowledge and brand, again, I would not want to do it. There are days, by the way, as an entrepreneur, there are days where you have to just work for money. Let's be honest about it. But then there are only those days, and you have to really ensure that you are breaking a rule as an exception, but not as a norm. Be willing to make trade-offs. Strategy is all about trade-off. You can't have both. You have to have either this or that. And in this section, I talk about what are the typical trade-offs that people tend to make as a part of their life, and more specifically as a part of the career. So some of the more traditional trade-offs are span of control versus specialization. You can't have an army of people under you and yet you can call yourself as a specialist. Doesn't happen that way. Scale versus complexity, and the IT industry in India is a great example where they chose scale over complexity. Today we can't do complex stuff. We can do stuff at scale, but complexity eludes us. Rapid growth versus personal time. Of course, if you want to be somebody by the age of 40, you have to eschew time from your family, from your personal development, etc. So that's a trade-off. Contacts versus content. Now this is an interesting one. For the longest time, people thought that who you know is more important than what you know. But in today's world where the transaction costs have come down radically, what you know is equally, if not more important than who you know, which is content versus contacts. You can't have it both. Attention to detail versus big picture view. Many people are so riveted to the attention to detail piece of it that they forget about the big picture. And if you are really looking at the big picture, you will err on the side of attention to detail, and that's something that you should be willing to take in the stride, or at least wrap around with the help of delegation. Expertise versus empathy. The more expert you become in a given domain, the less empathetic you tend to become. You already know the answer before the question is being asked. So that's a trade-off. Popularity versus freedom. If you really want to be popular, then obviously you have to convince people, meet their expectations, understand their expectations, and that would certainly come at the cost of freedom. There are a few more which I talk about, but this is a section which is close to my heart. I also talk about how do you really spend your money. A lot has been written about earning money, and in this piece I talk about how do you spend money. And my invocation is that you have to spend money on stuff which you use at a high frequency, instead of spending money on the stuff that you use rarely. So you rarely use jewelry, you rarely use a farmhouse, you rarely use some elaborate dresses, and yet you end up spending a lot of money. And the stuff that you use more frequently on a daily basis, like your mattress, pillow, shoe, undergarments, toothbrush, maybe a bike, right, or kitchen, or food, you tend to cut corners on those because you want to really save for that big day. But I just want to question you that should you not really use money and improve the quality of your day-to-day living as compared to something which is an occasional. Be politically savvy. Now, normally B schools and colleges don't talk about politics as a course, in the sense that nobody says that you need to be politically savvy, but I think anybody who has attempted to even remotely attempted to offer an idea would admit that it is very critical that you create a coalition around your idea. Remember, it's not the best idea that wins, it's the most acceptable idea that wins. And whose job is to make the idea acceptable? It's your job to make the idea acceptable. You should be willing to rally people around your idea, and in the process, if idea has to be morphed, so be it. It doesn't really make any difference. The idea should be morphed, idea can be morphed. And that is where we have this very beautiful technique called the stakeholder map. So what's a stakeholder map? A stakeholder map is a mapping of the various parties who are related directly or indirectly with the idea. And by mapping the motivations and the fears of each of the stakeholders, you can then really calibrate how you should be going about that idea. Who wants what? Okay. How do you maintain strategic mindset? You also maintain a knowledge differential, but not an information differential. So you see, when I'm making this video, I'm trying to teach you something. I'm going to a college, I'm giving a lecture or doing a program. I'm trying to impart some knowledge. Now, how do I ensure that the knowledge differential between me and my audience is always maintained? One way of doing it is I teach them less and hoping that they remain ignorant. And the second is to learn more. So I teach them as much as I can, but at the same time, I need to also up my ante in terms of ensuring that I'm always on the top of my game. So yeah, that is where we are. And I've tried to close this chapter with a very beautiful quote by Edwin Markham, and the quote is so lovely, I'll read it for you. And this is about being prepared at all times and having a strategic outlook. So the quote goes like this: "For all your days prepare, and meet them ever alike. When you are the anvil, bear. When you are the hammer, strike." So this was it, chapter number 5, strategy. Thank you so much.